Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another casual stroll through Lord of the Rings Online. My name is Matt Elliott. I go by Scenario on the message boards, and I'm a senior world designer here on Lotro. I've been doing this for many years now. We're celebrating, or we just finished celebrating our 16th year on Lotro, so it's exciting to have a game that's been running this long. So today's stream is going to be Eryn Lasgalen and the Dale Lands. We're going to kind of try to double up on here, especially since we're almost at the end of our Rovanian explorations. I think we've only got a couple more regions to go. I think there's just Wildermore, Eryn Mithrin, and um, Ironfold left. I think those are the I think those are the three regions that we have left. But for now, we're going to go through Northern Mirkwood, otherwise known as Eryn Lasgalen, as well as Dale and the Dale Lands. These, from my understanding, so I was not a part of the construction of these regions, but from my understanding, these both kind of came out at the same time, and they kind of represented the first post Mordor experience that players were going to be having. And it really kicked off the region with a solid start by watching, and unfortunately, I don't have it set up to do this, but seeing Galadriel just tear down Dol Guldur, which is a fantastic sight to see in the game, and I don't think there's a great view of it from here. Let me boost my run speed a little bit. I believe it's kind of meant to be down in that direction, and this is where you pick up after that story moment. So before I get too far into this stream, just to give everyone a reminder that this is a world design focused stream. So I'm happy to answer and talk about things regarding world design, level design, what goes into the research and development of the landscapes that we build here in Middle Earth. I'm not going to be able to answer questions for you in regards to things like game systems, classes, balance, what's going on with PvMP, what's going on with crafting updates, those sorts of things. Those aren't my area of expertise, so it's best that I'm really not the one that answers those questions. You're better off asking those kinds of questions either on the message boards or waiting for a stream featuring one of the people from those teams. So yeah, with that in mind, I'm going to start our tour of Northern Mirkwood. To begin with, we'll work our way through into Dale and the Dale Lands after, and then if we have time, we'll pop into some of the interiors that are in there. There really wasn't much that I could find that was undeveloped spaces for these regions. So that means that we're somewhat lean on how we were building things, which nothing wrong with that. Off just in case there's any fun day file stuff that's happening. So yeah, we'll start on our way down. I think you players start their experience in North Mirkwood, at least is if they're following the storyline in a way that they probably wouldn't expect to, because you start out up on top of a mountain and it's bright and it's beautiful out, and that is all of a sudden very quickly just kind of thrown out the door as you start moving into the depths of the forest. I think I remember doing some research just when I had come back to the team after my hiatus, um, and looking at what had been built, and was kind of astonished at just the sheer number of different foresty style day files that were made for Eryn Lasgalen, because of all the different varieties of you know heavy forest, light forest, things at night, like spooky, dark forest as we're about to enter here. And to some degree too, and while I know it's fitting the for the environment and for the stories being told in some of these spaces, I always found that there were aspects of Mirkwood that were almost unplayable too dark, like unplayably too dark, especially when there are quests that are asking you to follow a road and do that sort of thing, where it's just like you really can't see what's going on. And I think that's something that's like a balancing act that I think we had a little bit of an issue with in Mordor and in some other areas of the game as well. You know, where do we draw the line between an accurate representation of the lore in the game, and making a space playable? Um, and if something gets too dark, whether it's actually physically too dark, like we have here, potentially have here, in the nighttime, at least in Mirkwood, or in Mordor, where just the coloration of everything is so dark, it can make it really hard to see and know where you are in the world. Um, I have to say, one of my favorite features of Northern Mirkwood, particularly at night, is when you can see the eyes glowing in the distance, which is like a neat little kind of like technical feature of Mirkwood, and just in general, where we kind of do like I think we call it like a reverse degrade, reverse LOD uh, on different things. Um, let's see where we are on the map. Bring this up. Oh, so I've inadvertently almost found my way all the way to the Bjorning Lands. Bjorning Lands was actually like a really interesting boundary between the Mirkwood and the Vales of Anduin, where when Mirkwood was first introduced and we're coming up here to the Forest Gate, um, this area was very closed off from everything. Like, this was here, but it was closed. Um, so you could only get your like little sneak peek of it. Whereas when we introduced the Bjorning Lands, when we introduced the Vales of Anduin, it was an opportunity for us to, and I can show it a little bit as I move around, like take these tree walls and poke a few holes in them here and there to kind of make the boundary between the regions a little bit softer. So you can see here, this is, you can see the Bjorning Lands down here, and this is originally was just tree walls. Um, I do really, really love these trees. I think one of the things that, from the old forest into Eryn Lasgalen, like we've really done a great job of figuring out how to build this like dense canopied forest, and I think that feels great, and especially with the like variety of the trunks that we have here, there probably aren't a ton of different trees. I think there's maybe like 3 or 4 different types of trees in this forest, at least the big ones anyways. But one of the keys to like good assets in building landscapes is if you can have a small number of assets that all you need to do is scale them and rotate them in different ways, and it can look like you have a big unique forest, all around you. I think that's where like things like the Binbull Wood were really successful too, where it's just like the number of trees that were in there was relatively small. What do we got going on here? I bet you this guy is a roaming threat, right? Um, so yeah, like all you need is that small number of really solid assets, and you can create something that just looks really varied and really, really interesting with lots of great different silhouettes to it. All right, so let's see if I can head north slightly to get into Spider Town. But yeah, I mean, I think with the old forest, with Mirkwood here, one of the tricky things is always navigation. You want to be able to know where you're going. You want players to be able to kind of know where they're going, but you also want that sense of mystery. Um, Bats everywhere. Am I almost there? So we'll run down in here. So take a quick pause to take a look at the chat and see if there are any questions while we look over this lovely, lovely spider-infested hollow. I do love these spiders. These, I think, where are you? Right here. These guys are some of my favorite spiders in the game. They just like they look scary. They've got that little bit of glow to them. I think that's just they're a great presence. Um, Anyway, so let's take a look at the chat real quick and see what's going on. Druid's Fire says, this place fulfilled my hopes of what it would look like and feel like from reading the books. And I think we nailed that very well. There is only one thing I might try to push a little bit more, is try to find a way to have a little bit more contrast in the space. Like, our fog is very linear in how it progresses. And sometimes that fog can lead to things feeling pretty flat, and not in a like necessarily bad way, but you can tell when a progression of something is just a like average ramp, um, which is what our fog is, um, and so it doesn't really you don't really get a good sense of depth and extra additional darkness here and there. It like sometimes fog wants to feel like a volume more so than a linear ramp, and that's one of the things that I wish we had the better tools for, was different ways of managing and handling fog. We can place objects and entities down to simulate things like fog and mist and whatnot, but those aren't always as you can see them here, where it's like they're still just planes. They're not a necessarily a like programmatic feature. It'd also be great if we could have fog work in different directions too. Like right now, the fog works in a linear progression from where your character is out to in a straight line ahead, out to like a point where it just becomes all of that color. And it'd be great if we could change it so that the progression ramps, vertically instead of from the like those sorts of things. Um, and maybe someday we'll get that. Uh, Ponton Finberry says, I like in the areas and parts far off in the distance, you can see the eyes. Yep, that is, I think, one of my favorite features of Mirkwood is seeing those eyes glowing in the distance. Um, you know, a piece of the story kind of come to life. That's something that was, oh hey, swimming spider. That was something that was just noted in the stories itself. The fact that as Bilbo and company were trudging through these forests, they couldn't see the creatures themselves that were lurking in the woods, but they could see their eyes glowing in the distance, and that kind of feature provides an ominous tone, um, that can kind of ramp up the scariness and the tension in a space without actually adding any real physical threat to it. All right. So Lomefine says, I always wondered about the inaccessible semicircle of mountains between Mirkwood and the Dalelands, exactly around the Dalelands on the map. Looks somewhat unnatural. Let's see. So this here. So yeah, I can't speak to, and maybe we'll get to that to take a look at it at some point. Maybe rocket jump in it to see what's up there. But a lot of the times when we're building out spaces like this, we do need to be aware of how much how much space we have to actually play with, how much makes sense to build out, and whether or not something might be more useful to save for later, when/if we get around to actually working on it, building it out. And it feels like that and the kind of mountains and forests all up in here are very much that kind of thing, where it's just like, you know, maybe later, not for right now, but who knows what could be going on in here. And that's stories that could be told at another time for us. Let me hide this. All right, so Kaifir says, I'd love to see Mirkwood expanded. Would that technically be possible with the space on the Rovanian map? I think we have a lot of space. There's so if we zoom out here, so we built basically the vertical from Lothlorien all the way up through to the Wells of Langfoot and Gundabad, and we've built from probably about here north. So I'm pretty comfortable in saying that there would be options, in here, in these areas to continue building out if we so decided that's what we wanted to do. That's not our current direction. But that's not to say there couldn't be things like the wildwood or the angle that are produced that could fit in these spots. I don't think that, considering where it would make most sense for us to build a thing like that again. I don't think it would make sense for us to do something in these areas just because of the high level need in here. I feel like Bjorning Lands was what a level, or Vales of Anduin was, I think, a level 120 area. And I can, and this is a level 115 area. And I think really the next time we do like filling in the gaps region, we should really consider doing something to help along the lines of the Moria level band, something that's like 45 to 65. Um, and it feels like there's no good easy way for a level 45 to 65 player to get into these areas. Let's see if I can find my way back to the road, or what passes for a road here in Eryn Lasgalen. Um, and this way. Just help myself out here. There we go. So Druidfire says, so Kyvier says, Mountains of Mirkwood could be a cool potential locale, forested mountainsides with dells and inland lakes, maybe even some rustic wood elf settlements. Um, Certainly, there's that. There's the Narrows and the East Bite, which could expand upon the stories of the woodmen that live here in Holtvis and whatnot. Middle Mirkwood is kind of what we're calling this area in general. So opportunities abound should they ever present themselves. Druidsfire says, I do appreciate I do appreciate that the mobs are spaced enough far enough from the main path that you can race lobies through to the thoughts of Bilbo during the birthday event to get the birthday title. Um, one of the things that here we go, here's the road, that I try to do, and encourage our content designers to do, is make sure that we have a good mix of aggro types in our mix spawns. Um, Sometimes we're more successful than others. Sometimes um, it's harder to make that happen based off of the things that we have in the mix spawns. And sometimes there's just like I don't have enough time to do the review. So I think like with King's Gondor, I think there are a couple of creature types in there that could stand to be threatened and not as aggressive. And maybe that's something that we patch in at a later time. Um, it was certainly something in the Vales of Anduin that I was really hoping to push for. And in areas like Mirkwood, where most of what's here is wildlife, it makes sense to have things that are more passive or threaten rather than straight up aggro. All right, so we'll head over here and then hit Karis Tillian, and then work our way up to Felagoth. And that'll probably conclude most of our Mirkwood visit, and then we'll make our way to Dale. Almost there. I have to keep checking the map. So yeah, like this area that I'm in right now is one of the areas that I feel is like the least navigable. That's the word. The hardest to navigate in Mirkwood, just because of how how densely dark it is. Caristilian is this way. And it really needed a little bit more. Oh no, that's just the edge of the river. Right. It really needed a little bit more light to it. It whether that's the player key light that's on the player right now gets pushed out a little bit further, or the ambient is just boosted just a little bit so that you can really see some mid-ground silhouetting, which I think is like important for navigating through the space. Like you don't really like this is really, and I don't have any ambient settings set here, so like I really want to be able to just see a little bit more of a silhouette, a little bit more of a contour in this at this distance. Um, and those are easy adjustments for us to make if we ever felt we had the time or motivation to make such adjustments. But right now we are full on focused on getting update 36, update 38 landscape stuff all buttoned down. So we probably won't be able to get to those things if that's even like worth us doing. I'm not even talking about like major drastic changes, just like slight tweaks here and there to make things a little bit easier to navigate. Oh, I'm being told to drink. Today's drink is a ginger beer because I haven't had these in a while. A little bit spicier than normal ginger ale. But thank you for the reminder. So Eros216 says, when you build diverse zones, how do you make the transitions from one to another? Like Eryn Lasgalen is very different from Lake Town. How do you make the transitions seem natural? So I think some of it is making sure that we have a little bit of um, overlap in how the design of the space goes. Like having, if we're going from a densely forested area to an area that does not have a lot for forests, we want to make sure that we have the dense forest and then we have kind of a lighter mid-range forest that's on those boundaries. Now, my memory is a little foggy on this area because I was not part of the construction of it, so I'm not entirely sure if we did that very successfully here, but we'll find out when we cross out of here into the Dalelands. But that's generally what I hope for. I think Lotro's in the original regions that we produced for Lotro really suffered a lot from the theme park design that a lot of MMOs were doing in that time, and there wasn't a lot of consideration put into the ecology and the geography and just into like building a space that felt like it could be a real space, because we were very much just like, here's the character of this space and then here's the character of the space next to it. Does it make sense? Eh. Because I think we were more focused at the time in successfully nailing geographic tropes more so than portraying a complete world, if that makes sense. Um, Number of times I have jumped off here. Boom, boom. If only you could see my chat spewing all the times that the game was telling me I would have died doing that. So yeah, like you look at Breland next to Lowlands, for example, and that's interesting. Breland next to Lowlands, for example, where it's such an extreme biome shift that it does feel kind of weird. And I think now if we were to build that, we would probably not have gone as arid and savanna like with the Lowlands. I think we could still push the concept of that, but I think it's just such a harsh transition from Breland's lush like Chetwood Forest and whatnot, and the Midgewater Marsh to what is the Lonelands. That like it could be better. Um, so I think there's much like when we're creating areas inside a region, like I think there's value in making sure we have a transition, or we have some consistency between um, regions, at when they where they overlap, where they might share some similar spaces. Edith Eldora says this is definitely one of the most atmospheric locations in game. It's also one of the most frustrating. I agree, and that's kind of where I was uh, coming from in talking about trying to find ways to make silhouettes appear a little bit more at a distance, um, kind of help players have a sense of place in there. Like it's really hard to know where you're running to and where you're going to when you really can't see more than 15 feet in front of you. And while that may be appropriate for the lore of the space, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy on the players. There's that balance between navigation and frustration, being accurate to the kind of world that we're building and being kind to, basically kind to our player base. And at the end of the day, we're making a game, so there are like I've always said, there are allowances and concessions that we have to make for the purposes of playability. This is a really interesting like interior space here. This is like, what if elves did Moria? I always found this, just as I've been when I play through here, I've always found this to be one of the more confusing spaces to navigate as well. In part because it is such an organic space. Like I feel like Moria, at least, like Moria and Gundabad, while there is some kind of organic movement and flow through the various caves and passages, it's also somewhat like square in how it's presented. And Felagoth is just much more of a, there's much more roundedness to it. There's, you know, more irregularity to all the different spaces. So you're never really able to just basically go in one direction to know that you're going to arrive at your destination, having gone in that one direction. Moria has a little bit of like headaches on that front, but by and large, like if you pick a direction and you head in that direction, in most cases you'll get where you want to go eventually. Um, I feel like in Felagoth, it's just such a windy space that it is really hard to know like where you're going to end up, how you're getting where you're getting to, that sort of thing. This is why I keep referencing the map, because I'm worried I'm going to get lost. All right, I need to go south. Kefir says, kind of unrelated to the current stream, but do you ever see something like homesteading being possible in housing, i.e., raising crops and animals? I remember you and Ryan touched on this briefly months ago. Would be sweet. So for housing stuff, both Ryan and I, Alan and I have long-term goals and plans that we would like to see achieved with the housing system, and I think we both want to see it become a system that really, while there is a lot of value in it being a place where players can, build what they want, decorate how they like. There's also opportunities for it to grow um, into other systems and other methods of character progression and just even social play. We um, there was one pitch that a designer had made for housing years ago that he called the Victory Gardens, where it brought a little bit more of a like Animal Crossing style experience to Lotro, where it was, you'd have your own garden plot basically, and you could use it to, grow your own, unique crops and whatnot. And that was really interesting. I think we have the spec for it kicking around somewhere, but it's not something that we've done anything yet with. And some of that is because we kind of want to find a way to, get housing, get its systems, get some additional features that we want before we are able to really kind of grow it into something that's more robust. I think there are some low hanging feature fruit basically that we'd like to see before where am I? That we'd like to see before we dig too deep into asking for more stuff. And that's always a balancing act. Like I would happily fill up our engineers' time with housing requests and world world feature requests, but they've got other bigger fish that need to be fried before they can turn their attention towards those things. All right, so I think at this point I'm gonna try to work my way. Actually, here we go. I'm gonna work my way out of Felgoth, so we can now make our way towards Dale. So while I'm running, so yeah, there was a comment from Edith Alora saying that players can also adjust their own ambient settings if need be. And while that is true, um, I think it's beneficial to try to require that as little as possible on average. We know, part of the reason why those ambient settings exist is because not everyone's monitor is the same. It's like whenever you start up a video game of some sort, they're particularly console games. There'll be that little slider on the screen that's like, adjust your settings until you can just barely see this or that, and that exists in large part because different monitors, different screens project differently. Um, so when you have something like that here in this game, that's by and large what it's for. Some people may prefer it to be, super bright all the time, and that's fine. Um, I know there's also like people have complaints about areas where we force them to have the player key light on them, like we have here. Um, we'll never produce an area that doesn't have any lighting in it whatsoever, because that's just forcing players to then have to go into their settings and update their settings. So even with like the player housing, like Rohan and Erebor and whatnot, where and yeah, Rohan and Erebor, where you have the ability to place down your own lights. There's still a certain base level of lighting that exists there. Pardon me, allergies are hitting me. All right, let's see. Kaifir says, when do you think Lotro started to get away from theme park design as a dev? Maybe Moria, maybe as soon as Evendim, or slow evolution across all of these. So I think probably after we launched the game, after we launched Shadows of Angmar, and it became a live service is sort of where I think we took a step back and started thinking about trying to build things a little bit more realistically. The Evendim and Foreshell, we tried to have that progression between the two. Certainly from North Downs um, to Fields of Fornost into Evendim, like there was kind of that overlap of kind of gloomy, spooky um, landscape. Let's change that. There we go. So I think we really kind of started thinking about it in that way there, with Eregion and trying to have those lower impassables that felt more like it was an open landscape, open world kind of feel, as opposed to something that was penned in. And then I feel like everything after that is just kind of like naturally growing here and there. Trying to not trying to make every region feel completely wacky, wild, different, and not make um, every sub portion of a region have its own like heavy character. It's more about finding ways to use a consistent palette of assets within a region, but use them in different ways to convey changes to character in a landscape. Edith says, as a city slicker, I've never noticed any unnaturalness about terrain and biome shifts. And like not everyone ever, not everyone notices those sorts of things because their interests and what they're focused on is very different. Like I pay attention to that sort of thing in everything that I play, every game, regardless of what it is. Um, just because that's by nature, that's the work I do, and that's the sort of thing that I enjoy thinking about. Another drink. So yeah, as you can, we'll talk a little bit about it here. So you can see how we have in the distance you have the forests of Mirkwood there, with how like dark and foreboding they are, and then you have these like lighter, thinner forests here along the edge, along the edge of the mountains, which kind of represents like a lightening of Mirkwood. There's still the forest present, but it is not there. It is not as oppressive, and it acts as kind of a transition between the two spaces. I really do like the silhouettes of these mountains up here. These are great silhouettes. Now all we need to do is get some of the cloud banks that we have, that we brought in for Vales of Anduin, and just get them up in the mountains too. And that would look great. Um, Lost Shire Hobbit says, one of my best friends loved Felagoth. How did the idea to include it come about, and where did the name come from? So Felagoth is, it's part of the lore. It is from the book The Hobbit, where it gets most of its attention. It's the seat of power for the Wood Elves, and I forgot to take a look at our friend over here, Smog. So, you know, most most major landmarks like that, at least in areas that are core to the books, have a description in them that we base a lot of our work and our research off of. So Felagoth is that it is it is a result of our research saying, hey, this city needs to be here and it makes sense for us to go here, um, as part of the story. Even part of our story, even though the time frame in which the that city, that uh, Steadfast, existed in the lore was mostly handled in the Hobbit. The introduction of it in our current timeline, the post Ring Drop Moria timeline, or Mordor timeline, like it made sense. Um, Yao asked, "Did you ever consider a Felgoth housing area while building it?" I can't speak for the folks at the time that it was built. I believe I don't know how often the team was thinking about housing areas. Like I'm always thinking about housing areas. I've got specs and whatnot up the wazoo for all the different things that we could do with housing. Places we could go, types of housing, styles of neighborhoods, like that sort of thing. Um, and I think something like Felagoth is on the short list for cool elf style places. Like there are a few like elf style places, which is like it makes sense for us to consider an elf neighborhood in the near future. Um, because you have Rivendell's style, which is different from Lothlorien style, which is different from Thelagoth style, which is honestly even different from stuff like in Kellendim and the Falathloran homesteads. So like there's a whole bunch of different styles of elfiness out there that we could leverage to build neighborhoods in. This is one of my favorite parts of Lake Town. Just the underpinnings here. I thought this was when I first played through this, like not having been a part of the building of it, but having just like first played through it. I thought this was just such a cool, like didn't have to do it, but here it is kind of addition. Um, even like looking at this, like I see plenty here that could be like, oh, well, we could do Lake Town housing at some point. And I know I'm driving all of our housing fans crazy by talking about all the different ideas for housing. Uh, Druid's Fire says, legit wish there was a stable master at Logland. I think so that speaks to something that's like frustrated me very much playing through Gondor, and how sparse the stable masters are in comparison to the number of hubs there are. Like there are a lot of towns and villages that function as quest hubs, um, but very few of them actually have stable masters, and that's always been somewhat frustrating to me. Um, because I feel like if something is feels important enough to be a hub, then it probably should have like a major city or town or like it like yeah the and we'll talk more about it when I get to doing the stream through Gondor and whatnot, but it's definitely a case of like excuse me, a case of like this needs more hubs. Like we need more stable masters. um the and it's interesting like the differences too, because like you look at something like Moria, and Moria has a ton of stable masters, but they're just not well connected at all. um so that's the pros and cons to it, like and I think there's also a degree of different design principles at play too. Like for me, if I'm building a region, and King's Gondor is an example of this, where like in original Gondor, most of the hubs there didn't have stable masters, but for King's Gondor, I've added a ton of stable masters because I feel like having those travel options is important, and it helps keep movement through the region from being frustrating. Let's see. Fusel Heine asks, when you create a new animal like storks and herons for Cardaswan, do you also release them into the wild in other older regions like Great River or Evendim, for example? We don't usually retrofit things like critters or other creatures into mixed spawns in older regions when we've created something new, and that's by and large part because those spaces, those ecosystems may have content and deed plans that kind of rely on the spawns being what they are. Um, we don't want to mess up the balance of, deed hunters or quests giving and whatnot, and retrofitting in new types of creatures can throw that off. And then for critters, there's unless there is a very strong and compelling reason for us to do that retrofit, we usually don't either. We want to, make those new regions feel new and special. And part of what helps a new region feel new and special is if it has new looks and feels for things. Like we had the bees and wasps, which are brand new creatures that use sickle flies as kind of a base and inspiration, but we didn't really want to go through and retrofit like bees and wasps into something like the Shire because when we introduced them in the Bjorning lands, we wanted them to be something that was new and exciting for the Bjorning lands. You know, since then we've introduced them in the Wildwood has them, and the Wildwood's use of them was very intentional as a way to like show those level 40 characters, new and interesting um, creature artwork that they may not get to see again for another 40, 50 levels, depending on, you know, what that creature was. So yeah. Um, Eros 216 says, if time and resources allowed, would there be any changes you would make to this zone? I'm assuming at the time this was asked, it was talking about um, Mirkwood. And I think, the biggest thing for me would be adjusting, lighting a little bit in there to help improve navigation through the space because it can be a very oppressive space, and that's something that I try to be somewhat aware of as we're building like oppressive spaces is to find ways to give players breaks from that. That's why Gundabad is a bit better lit, but also like you bop in and out from being in the caves to out on landscape just to mix things up a little bit. Um, so Kaifir says, this reminds me, will you add any of those cloud banks to the White Mountains in King's Gondor? I greatly desire them when I was riding through there and taking a look at the Great Mountain silhouettes. So they have not been added into King's Gondor as part of what we're doing in Update 36. We talked about it a little bit, here and there. There was some discussion and desire to try to leave those as a potentially a Misty Mountains thing. I don't think we're gonna keep them purely as a Misty Mountains thing, because I think there's a lot of just like interesting stuff that you can do with them. Whether that's adding to ambience or even using them to help, hide um, pieces of landscape that shouldn't be entirely visible but somehow are. Like there's uses for them. We didn't bring them back into Gondor though. So Ellery H says more direct routes to the 21st Hall from major hubs would be great. So I've been trying to do that with the concept of the far-ranging stable masters and really allow capitals to access those things, whether it's through one, maybe two hops to get to different places. Um, that idea being like you could look at a stable master, and if it's a blue horse, like that's going to be able to take you outside of the region in some way. Um, I think there's no shortage of travel skills in the game now, whether that's through stable masters, through milestones. I think through the collections panel, which has its own costs associated with it. But if you look like here at Erebor, for example, this is a mission recruiter, so that's not going to be too helpful. Where's my other stable master? So this guy, for example, he's got Gundabad access, he's got Elder Slade, he's got Minas Tirith. Um, so there's a lot of places you can get, and it may take you one extra hop to get there. And I think that's okay. Requiring a hop or two to get where you need to go, I think is okay. Is it ideal? Depends on who you ask. But I don't want to trivialize the world too much. Um, Making it a little bit easier here and there to move around, I'm good with. But point click go, unless we had kind of a major overhaul to how our travel systems worked. Um, to make it easier on our end to provide all of those kind of routes without making me sad for weeks. um, I think until we have that kind of overhaul, it's not really realistic to be able to think of being able to connect everywhere together all the time. Um, at least in a way that isn't just a like stable master collection kind of thing. Talrian asks, do you ever consider when going into a new region that players should work to get the services in the new region, like unlock some of the Dol Amroth dailies back in the day with the Ringlore of Eregion, Filicule, Founder's Bounty, etc. Like X number of quests were done, X number of characters were here. Now the town will get a stable master. So we've done that here and there. Hitbolt is very much kind of an example of a progressive town. I think the the shorthand that we often use when talking about sort of that sort of thing is making your own Normandy. Like from Mass Effect, where Normandy was your home base kind of thing. So we sometimes think about those sorts of things. Like I said, Hitbolt's the main one. Lindleby, for example, you have to do the quests in Lindleby up to a certain point in order to get access to the Stable Master. But sometimes those things are a tough balancing act, though, because you don't want to. And this is something that you know back in the day when things like Foreshell or um, Eregion were the air quotes end game of a space, it made sense to have certain rewards gated behind um, progression through quests or deeds in an area. And now, as you look at them now, a lot of those areas are kind of stopover areas. They're not places that players are hanging out and really grinding, and by the time they unlock the things that the rewards that are offered by the quest, things like access to swift travel or access to um, discounts on things, like the player's done with the zone, like they're done and they're ready to move on, so it doesn't really make sense to force that kind of progress in a space that they're just going to leave. Um, so I think that's where stuff like housing is helpful, where you can use housing as your home base to give you access to a bunch of different services. We have the crafting. We have the craft facilities. We have the stable masters. A lot of those facilities are there because you have purchased them, whether through in-game methods or through purchasing them off of the store, and then you can grow your Normandy, your home base, in that way. So you can add functionality there. And I think there's an interest that both Alan and I have eventually in finding ways to really take that concept and make something like that kind of experience in housing. Um, I have a spec that I'm kind of like sitting and waiting for the right time to build that kind of helps you, lets you build your own home, and within the confines of what we can do in game, and then use that as your home base. We've talked about how to do events, different kind of events in your own home space. How could you do separate, specific festivals and whatnot for your own home, not just for the neighborhood at large or the world at large, but it's something that you're hosting at your own home that can kind of be like, I flip a switch, whether that's I completed some content, that sort of thing. So it's stuff that we are thinking about, but other things are higher priority, things, because we need the engineering support. So a lot of our engineering effort is heavily tasked now on making sure that we're working on lag issues and whatnot, and that means that some of the things that we would like to do with things like the housing system are not as high priority as what the main focuses of our engineering teams are. So Soft Snake GR says, "How you imagine the lands south of the Dalelands? All those green or empty, and are those lands green or empty and wild?" So the fields of Celadwyn, which would be kind of here-ish. I'm not quite sure how we would call those out. We'd have to do a little bit of research to really find that out. I'm hesitant myself to say what a region would look like one way or another without having done the research myself, and I haven't done the research on that. I would imagine there's aspects of it that are reminiscent of Dale and the Dale lands. There are aspects of it that are reminiscent of the edges of the of Mirkwood. Um, so it wouldn't surprise me if that sort of thing was like that. I wouldn't make it a harsh transition to something that is a very different kind of space without a like major geographic feature to justify it. Like sometimes mountain ranges and sheer cliffs can work wonders for justifying a change in a space, because that's a very drastic change in geography, and drastic changes in geography do a lot to the land. So now, as we're like going down through here, we're quickly approaching some of the lesser visited areas of Dale. Like, I don't think there's a ton that gets you down in this area, and I'm not sure how often people actually make their way down here outside of hitting their quests and then heading out. It always surprised me just how much it feels like there is all around here. I'm just gonna do this for giggles. Boom. You fell down. All right, so let's take a look at a couple more questions. So Arrow says, "Sound like we have a Mass Effect fan here." Well, I think there are certainly, I think looking at any game, as a designer, you should be able to look at a game and be able to know, like, and be able to think objectively, like, wow, this game did this thing good, or this game did and I think one of the things that a lot of people really gravitated towards, and I'm gonna talk while I swim across the river to get to the gate here, the south gate, to wrap up the stream. I think one of the things that Mass Effect did really effectively is make it feel like your home base was a space that kind of evolved with your game, and it's pretty aspirational. Um, I think people like that feeling of, um, my actions caused these changes, and from the perspective of scope, it's a lot easier to think about, you know, having your efforts in game um, affect a smaller space. That's a lot easier to accomplish than it is to have it be a like whole world change. Um, And so like a lot of what they did in Mass Effect, while it felt like you were doing a lot in your own space, it was really only affecting that spaceship. And I think that's really appealing. You can get a lot of mileage out of that. So there's a question that says, I got a very high into I got in very high level regions on low level characters. Would it be possible to rescue those guys by using stable master debris most of the time? I cannot travel home since the level requirement is a bit high, too high for that low level character. If there are kind of like escape routes that feel like the level requirement on them is too high, like if there is a Bree Town travel route that is level 60 requirement, that should really be like a level 5 requirement. Feel free to file bugs on it, and that's stuff that we can take a look at. Like anytime you see something that looks or feels like it shouldn't be as restrictive in that way, certainly file bugs. That's how we know and how we get them on our plate, right? Um, So, lots of people have questions about what I was talking about building your own home. I can't talk about details about it, just because it's something that we're still figuring out the spec on, and we don't really have a timetable for when we want to do something like that. It's an idea that's in our heads, and we've put some of those ideas on paper, but that's about as far as it's gotten right now. uh, Julie Julie Avicon says, I noticed that older maps have been getting updated. Do you guys have plans for that? Like, is it staggered? So we've been updating maps as we've been updating regions. So usually whenever a region gets updated, um, in particular in a way that would impact the map, we try to make sure the maps are getting updated. So things like, we'll back out here, and we'll go to the Lonelands. So this Loneland map, for example, was updated as part of Before the Shadow. And the biggest reason why it was updated is because this whole southern impassable is now no longer an impassable. And it's changed very drastically. And it didn't make sense to try to update the old style, in part because like I think there's even difficulty in finding some of those old style maps. The methods that were used to make them, they may not even like look the same, so it's a little bit easier to just update to a new consistent style throughout. That's why the angle is what it is. That's why the Trollshaw's map got updated. These were all done to help it be a consistent style that makes it a little bit easier to work with when we need to do map updates. Um, all right, let's see. Last couple questions, and then we'll wrap this up. Um, so, is it possible to make the day last even longer, or at least make it optional? I really enjoy more playing during Lotro daytime rather than night. Um, in order to maintain like this all goes back to the kind of immersiveness of the world itself. Um, we do try to have our night cycles be shorter than our day cycles, um, and they are built in such a way so that if you consistently log in at the same time every day, the days cycle in such a way that you're not always stuck on playing on nighttime. For example, it will cycle through, so that you will have daytime playtime, you'll have nighttime playtime. I think it's important to have the cycles in the day to help convey the sense of the world. I appreciate what you're saying, and I know that some people, prefer the look and feel of the game in certain times of day. But I think we're probably not going to introduce a feature like that. Not to say we wouldn't ever, but we probably wouldn't, at least in terms of our list of priorities now. All right. Well, I think that about does it for this stream. We've already done our walk through King's Gondor, which will be coming out very soon. Bull Roar for that is live now. If I had been able to get my client up and running, I would have been on Bull Roar today. Um, but yeah, so thank you everyone for checking this out, hanging out with me, asking your questions. Eryn, Lasgalen, and the Dalelands are a great kind of like a great start to kind of the next part of the game of Lotro, from when they were introduced, and we'll soon be heading into territory that I'm much more familiar with, having worked on it. Um, so yeah, I think our next one will probably either be Arid Mithrin, Ironfold, or Wildermoor, one of those three. We're getting close to being done with Orvanian, and then we can move on to Gondor and Mordor, which will be a lot of fun, and there will be a poll coming out for that. In the meantime, for those of you that are interested, like I mentioned before, Bull Roar is up and running. Is Bull Roar 3. King's Gondor is on there. We've got landscape difficulty changes on there. I think the biggest thing that is not available on it right now is the main storyline for that update. That, as we usually do, keep it hidden. But anyways, so thank you everyone for hanging out. I'll let you go now and have a great afternoon.